Hi, I'm Brandon Briscoe, and welcome to another episode of The Postscript, Living Faith Bible Institute's weekly podcast and YouTube series devoted to interviewing pastors and professors from LFBI and across the Living Faith Fellowship. And each week we come together, we're having conversations about ministry, about theology, and sometimes we have conversations about church history. And I think that church history is an area in which many Christians know very little about. But as they say, you can always learn a lot from the past and what things have come before you. And so history is very informative in how we should move forward with our faith. We can learn a lot from it. And so I think it's important for us to consider how the church has changed and progressed, both for good and bad, over the last couple thousand years. Now, today we're going to be talking about modern missions, and maybe you've heard that term thrown around before, but today I've invited a very good friend of mine, Pastor James Fyffe, missionary and professor of missions here at Living Faith Bible Institute, to talk to us about modern missions and what we can learn from it and why it's so important and significant, how it's impacted us even today as missionaries and ministers of the gospel. And so, James, welcome. I'm glad to have you on the show, man.
Thank you, Brandon.
Good to have you here, man.
Great to be here.
Before we get started, this is a subject that I think a lot of people aren't familiar with, right? And so they'll hear the term modern missions, but they don't necessarily know what that means, what that implies. So could you maybe just start by defining for us what modern missions is?
Yeah, sure. I think I'll start a little farther back and give us a quick ramp up.
Okay.
The part that people are familiar with, Jesus had his 12 disciples. Luke 9, he sends out the 12. And Luke 10, he sends out the 70 then. So it's the beginning of missions. It's being sent by Jesus. It was had some unique characteristics at that time. A kingdom of heaven focus, so go and do the works, preach, heal. And, sheep among wolves, kind of the things that Jesus told them.
Yeah. And we've talked, just to pause there, we've talked about the differences between kingdom of God and kingdom of heaven in other episodes. But just briefly, kingdom of heaven means a focus on the kingdom of the nation of Israel with the Messiah reigning on the throne.
So physical, tied to this earth, tied to the physical things.
And that was really the focus. When Jesus was on earth with his disciples, that was the focus. They were kind of giving that gospel message.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep. So Jesus dies, resurrects. Great Commission given to his disciples. They don't do a great job with that initially. You get up to Acts 9 and they're still all gathered together. And Stephen's martyrdom, the killing of Stephen, and then the subsequent persecution that comes ends up scattering the believers out of Jerusalem. So this is the beginning of missions, in antiquity. That's not modern missions. Right. But that's where we came from. And in the first few hundred centuries after that, missions was really based and driven out of persecution. The early church just was under persecution after persecution after persecution. It's like every, Roman leader who came along was, let's just kill all the Christians. It was a very good time to be a Christian. In that, the gospel was stretching to every corner of the Roman Empire. Christians didn't have a very long lifespan, didn't have a very favorable death. But in spite of that, the gospel was going forth. It was good in the sense that there were no lukewarm Christians, right? You knew the cost. You were all in or you weren't. And so that was good for Christianity. I gotta tilt this up so I can see it.
That's cool.
But I want to read something real quick from Fox's Book of Martyrs, referring to those first 200, 300 years. It says, in that age, every Christian was a missionary. The soldier tried to win recruits. The prisoner sought to bring his jailer to Christ. The slave girl whispered the gospel in the ears of her mistress. The young wife begged her husband to be baptized. Everyone who had experienced the joys of believing tried to bring others to the faith. So that kind of characterized that early time period, right? And then after that, if you look broadly at history, you go from about 500 to 1500, and you have the Dark Ages, or the Middle Ages, right? I guess we're not supposed to call them the Dark Ages anymore. It hurts the Dark Ages feelings.
Yeah, I've heard that.
So
it was pretty dark, especially in moments.
Yeah.
So
you have this 1,000-year period, where in terms of missions, persecution was still going on. Christians still existed. But I guess one big takeaway out of this segment of history is the idea that Satan is okay with there being a Bible so long as the Bible is a relic, so long as it's, tied to a lectern and delivered in a language that no one can understand. And that's largely what you had through that time period. Coming out of that, you move into the scientific revolution, kind of beginning right after that.
Yeah, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment.
And then the Enlightenment. So then, you had all the great thinkers of the time. And around that same time, so around that same Enlightenment period, the early mid-1700s, early 1800s, you also had the beginning of what is known as modern missions. So that's how we got there. A few other things that happened, just maybe important things historically, kind of through that timeline. In the late 1400s, the printing press was invented. So helping to bring us out of the Dark Ages.
Yeah, mass production of all kinds of literary content, but particularly the Bible.
Exactly. Yeah. John Calvin was born in the 1500s, kind of a big figure. We won't talk much about him, but just throwing him in there.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the production of the King James Bible in 1611 also had a big impact on getting us to where we were in the 1700s.
Right.
So go ahead.
But also in terms of missions, like one of the things that I think is important about this time frame is that travel became easier as well. Right. So in terms of traveling the seas and the oceans, there's better trade routes were better established. Technological advancements in terms of boats and travel, I think probably had some implications on missionaries who ended up traveling. I would assume so.
Yeah, absolutely. You saw a lot more big travel then. Of course, you had America becoming a nation in 1776, so crossing the Atlantic became commonplace as well. So around that time, you have what's known as the First Great Awakening, the 1730s to the late 1780s or so. And you had a guy named William Carey show up on the scene.
Yeah.
And he is known as the father of modern missions. So really, when we're talking about modern missions, this is where it all begins. And this period of missions, it's a little weird to call modern missions, this 300-year period since the 1700s up to today. It's a large period. But we still would say that's the birth of modern missions, right? So William Carey was a common man. He was a cobbler. He fixed shoes. He was largely self-educated, but he got a hold of the Bible, and God got a hold of his life. And as he read the Bible, he became convinced that it was that the Great Commission was given to every Christian, and this was kind of a new or maybe a reintroduced idea. It wasn't novel in that the early Christians got that, right? But that idea had been lost.
It was like baked into the early church,
right?
But throughout the Dark Ages and all the changes in Christianity culturally, the idea, the concept of the Great Commission wasn't really on the tips of people's tongues, I assume.
Right, and especially in England.
Yeah.
At that time, being scientific and being enlightened and being great thinkers and having all kinds of better options.
Yeah, and lots of theological conversations, but not necessarily, the commission conversations about going and doing and being.
Yeah.
More about the ideas of what Scripture teaches versus what it implies for our lives.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, William Carey gets really worked up about the idea of the Great Commission. And he starts telling people. He starts studying the Bible. He becomes pastors of small churches and gets together in a big fellowship meeting and starts telling people. He goes, "Hey, I think we should actually be sending missionaries." And he was met with a little bit of opposition, very different from the early Christians. Like they didn't immediately cut his head off or feed him to lions.
Right.
Actually, the opposition was, people said things like, if God wants to save the Indians or the nation of India or Africa or any other place, then God himself will do it. And he definitely doesn't need you.
Right. That's more of a reformed way of thinking about it.
Yeah. So I threw.
And so who was that opposition specifically?
Andrew
other
Fuller.
Pastors?
Okay. Some of the pastors and elders, just other people in the church. They were very comfortable in the church that they had in England. They were wealthy on the world stage. They were powerful and they had really everything they needed.
Yeah. Why rock the boat?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of the idea, is that we don't need to be missionaries. Was the general mindset. We'll let God go out and do it. an unfortunate mindset that had been brought into the church, as I mentioned, probably 200 years prior, with John Calvin. And so Carrie wrote that God's plan is the establishment of his kingdom through humankind. And so he still, had a very kingdom of heaven focus and the idea of bringing in a kingdom, but what he got was the idea of missions.
Yeah.
And the need to go and do it. People told him no way. And he said, well, I'm going to do it then, with or without you.
Yeah. So what'd that look like?
So, so Carrie is famous for saying a couple of things. One, he wrote this phrase, expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. Mm. And so it really looked like that. That became his life and his mantra. And it's been repeated a lot in churches and in Christianity. Just this idea that we can expect absolutely everything from God, and he can do absolutely anything. Mm-hmm. But what he expects of us is just to trust and to go and to try, right? And to do these things that may seem kind of wild. So for him, it meant actually for, a number of years, he just had to stay there and keep trying to persuade people to get behind the cause. Mm. He didn't have any support. He was told no way. Eventually, he writes what's commonly known as the Inquiry, but is fully known as an inquiry into the obligations of Christians to use means for the conversion of the heathen. Mm. It was we'd call it like a pamphlet or a tract, right, with the longest title ever.
That was fairly common in, back in the day, is to write some sort of, grand thesis with a huge title.
Title takes up 2 pages.
Right.
The rest of the book's 4 pages. That's kind of what it was. But what he said is that multitudes sit at ease and give themselves no concern about the far greater part of their fellow sinners, who to this day are lost in ignorance and idolatry, which was a really strong attack on his fellow countrymen and the state of Christianity at that time. Here we are, we sit in ease, we have the easy Christian life and a comfortable life, and a lot of the world still hasn't ever heard.
Right.
And that burdened him. Mm. And so, he ends up making the plea for India. India was his target. Mm-hmm. And he said, Andrew Fuller eventually comes back around. It takes a few years, but Andrew Fuller...
His initial opposition.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And some of these other elders, they end up actually coming back around and getting on board and saying, hey, well, okay, missions, maybe this is a good idea. Mm-hmm. And Andrew Fuller said, there is a gold mine in India, but it seems as deep as the center of the earth. Who will venture to explore it? And Carrie responded, I will go down. But remember that you must hold the rope. Mm-hmm. And so from there, you get the foundation of what we would call modern missions and a couple key ideas. One, that idea that every nation deserves to hear the gospel, or even every people, every tribe. And so that was born out of Carrie's idea to attempt great things for God. Mm-hmm. And then the idea of rope holders too. We use that term, among us, among some of our other missionaries that we support.
Yeah, it's a great thought. It's a great concept.
Oh man, yeah, the idea, the imagery, and even the way that it sprung out of, just it's beautiful.
Yeah.
So yeah,
maybe explain that, because we use that term around here pretty casually.
Yeah.
When we use that word, what do we mean by that?
So what we commonly mean would be like a prayer support or a partner to the missionary, right? And I think we've even cheapened it a little bit and loosened it. Not to say that prayer isn't important. Prayer is extremely important, extremely powerful. Mm-hmm. But literally what Carrie was saying in response to Fuller was saying, yeah, I'm on board now. Somebody should mine India, because souls are like gold and it's full of them. But it's just so deep, no one knows how to get down there. Mm-hmm. And what Carrie was saying is, I'll go down there. It's just that you've got to hold that rope. So you're literally responsible, for my life and my safety and my lifeline and my communication. It goes far beyond maybe what happens commonly in the church, where you have like a once in a while you get an update from a missionary and you go, oh yeah, I remember that guy.
Yeah.
Or you throw up a prayer.
Sure. Or you just have, a certain amount of money comes out of your account every month, and
right.
And you're doing your obligation, your duty, but your heart isn't necessarily tied up in the work.
Right. Yeah. So you have no thought and no heart for the work, like you said.
Right.
So if your hands are on the rope and someone's on the other end of it, I'm a rock climber.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Yeah. If you enjoy it.
Yeah.
You go occasionally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When it's your responsibility to be on the other end of the rope while the person's climbing, that requires all of your attention, right? It's a 2 hands on, eyes on, full attention type thing. Because if you take your hands off the rope, if you get lazy, if you get distracted, if that person were to fall and no hands are on the rope, you get what's going to happen. That's a big deal.
Yeah.
So when Carrie said, you got to hold the rope, that's exactly what he was implying, is that you have to be hands on the rope, eyes on the rope, attention on, tuned into this mission as much as me, as much as the one who's climbing, the one who's holding the rope has to be tuned in as well.
Yeah, that's really good and a good lesson for us. So tell us a little bit about Carrie Wendt. What did that look like in terms of his investment in India? What was the long-term impact, and even how successful were people at responding, both in India but also in Europe, in terms of help?
Yeah, people were shook by what he said. In Europe, they woke up. Carrie formed a mission society. This is, with modern missions, you got the birth of missions, agencies or societies as well. So that started happening, and that kind of caught fire.
Right.
Even
for those of us who aren't familiar with those types of organizations that still exist today in different forms, they probably don't look the same. What is it? I mean, we're local church focused. What is a missions organization or society, or what does that mean? Yeah.
So for Carrie, it was the idea that we're a group of people that it was like a fellowship at that time, where we cross, local church borders and say we all share this common goal of sending missionaries. And for them, it was a way to structure kind of a bigger base from which to pull missionaries and support and funds. And in a lot of ways, it is the same today. You'd have like the IMB, which would be a specific missions agency of the Southern Baptist. So all Southern Baptist churches are a part of.
Contribute to it.
Put funds in.
But even in our fellowship, we have something much smaller than that.
Yeah.
Where we work to help support missionaries that other churches are sending out that are like-minded.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And then you'll have others that are independent of the church completely, which is really what's grown out in recent years. So you'd have tons of different agencies that are just independent of a church. They're a mission sending agency, parachurch organization.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So what'd that look like? So Carrie has these guys who are backing his play, and then he goes. What's that look like?
So he goes with his family, and one other man goes with him. They go to India. It looks extremely difficult. Carrie writes in his journal that he had no idea how difficult it would actually be. In those first few years, his partner ends up abandoning the cause and returning to England. It was too difficult for him. Carrie struggles to find a way to learn the language, to connect in the society, to make money even. His family's starving.
At that time, there wasn't even a national language, was there?
He ended up learning Bengali.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's very broken up. India still to this day.
Yeah, thousands of dialects.
Right.
Yeah.
Languages all over the place. So yeah, not a national language, not a way to reach the whole continent. Probably still not today.
No, Satan has done a really good job of fracturing that.
Oh, absolutely.
That country. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, India is probably the prime example of that, but you see it in other places too. So it's extremely difficult for Carrie. He ends up losing one of his children at about the age of 5 or 6. He gets sick and dies of dysentery. Malaria strikes Carrie himself. And then his wife basically goes crazy and has a mental breakdown as she struggles through it. And a lot of struggles come out of her trying to deal with being this white woman in a weird country where nothing makes sense. And she breaks down. And various stories of the difficulties of that. She ends up kind of being confined to a room for the rest of her life. And, and Carrie would write about these things in his journal, which, you can still read in terms of, that would be a great resource, a great thing to read would be missionary biographies. Carrie's is out there, lots of them. But he would write about times like that, and he would say things like how difficult this is, and it's an unimaginable difficulty, and then the very next sentence would be but the word of God is still true, and his promises are still sure.
Yeah.
And as hard as it was for Carrie, he would always come back with that same type of echo, no matter what was going on. I've lost my son, but God's promises are still true. And so all told, he ends up spending 41 years in India. No furlough, never returns.
Wow.
Gives his life to it. It's written that at the time of his death, he could only count 700 converts, which is a funny way to write that.
Yeah, I'd be pretty pleased with that in my life.
Right. But in a foreign country, after having learned a foreign language and a culture and starting from zero.
Right.
Yeah.
It's exceptional, really.
Right.
But I can see that someone might interpret it as lesser than at the time, considering they didn't know what to expect. And the only thing to compare it to is Europe, where, everybody, at least on paper, was Christian.
Right.
Yeah. So at the time, it was probably, it seemed like a small number maybe.
And if you just compare it to the sheer size of India, even at that time, hundreds of millions, we're over 1 billion now, but so you got 700 souls amongst hundreds of millions. Was it worth it? Well, yeah. In the eyes of the Lord, and in the eye, if you spent 41 years mining gold and you brought out 700 large nuggets of gold, was that a worthwhile investment? Well, probably, considering the price of gold. Well, souls are worth far more.
And to be a pioneer, and maybe you can speak to this too, to be the first one at anything. I mean, you think about men like David Livingstone, or the Elliots, or whoever it is, the first one is, the Apostle Paul. It's always the hardest for that first guy to go break the ground. And there's always more sweat and toil when the field is unprepared. So I think it's a really powerful testimony. And I guess that's probably what makes him the father of modern missions, is that he was the one that's kind of set a prototype, right?
Yes.
Thank you so much for listening to the show. We want to hit pause right here and give you a glimpse of what it looks like to be a part of the Living Faith Bible Institute.
Hi, my name is Miles Cheadle, and LFBI is an incredible asset for anybody that wants to learn and to grow in their knowledge of the Word of God. And not just that, but to apply it in ministry and to grow as a minister. You have incredible preachers and pastors and missionaries that aren't just teaching the Word of God, but they live it out in their everyday lives. And so it makes the insights that they share incredibly practical for day-to-day ministry. Again, this is a place to continually be challenged in the Word. We don't want to be people that go stagnant in our walks. We need to be put in remembrance. And so even if you say, man, I learned these things years ago, well, we need to be put in remembrance and to continue to trust God to grow and to stretch us and to equip us to invest in others. And so if you haven't already, this is something that you want to be a part of. And so I just encourage you to consider that. Thank you. Bye.
To enroll for classes, visit lfbi.org. To support LFBI, please visit lfbi.org/support.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. The pioneers always pay the highest price. It's the hardest for them.
Yeah.
In any pioneering movement. And he did. He plowed the ground. And so the things that come out of this, we mentioned, the establishment of agencies, but the idea of world missions actually was rebirthed because of Carrie. That caught fire. It jumped the pond, came to America, and we have the Haystack prayer meeting.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, it was a college group of kids led by a guy named Sam Mills, not Sam Miles, Samuel Mills, and some friends. They would get together and pray, and they got a hold of Carrie's pamphlet. Actually, one day they were praying over it, and it started to rain on them, and so they ran and took cover under a haystack and continued praying until the rain let up. And by the time it was done, they had decided to give themselves to missions as well. They founded the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. So, they just followed Carrie's example and started recruiting missionaries and kind of laid the foundation for what would become campus ministry from there forward. You come all the way up into modern campus ministry, and it was really birthed out of that.
Wow.
So you should be thankful for that.
Yeah, I am thankful.
Yeah.
So what else in terms of Carrie's influence? There was other men that followed right behind him, other big names, missionaries that we talk about often. Maybe you can tell us some of those guys and what kind of influence Carrie had on them.
So about 100 years after Carrie, you get to Hudson Taylor.
Yeah.
Another huge name in missions. And he believed, so to take a step back real quick, Carrie only ever penetrated the coast of India. He spent his life, just reaching where he landed and settled. And for a long time, that's how missions went, is that those pioneers, they didn't press too deep in because they're just establishing a presence and an outpost. At that time, Africa was called the Dark Continent. They believed there was absolutely no Christian presence there. China had very little Christian presence. So 100 years later, you get to Hudson Taylor, and he believed in the idea of getting past the coast and actually reaching an entire country or even an entire continent for Christ. And so he began what he called the China Inland Mission. And he, of course, was persuaded and influenced by Carrie, and he took the idea of missions a step farther in his inland approach, in his approach to reach an entire continent, which is a huge goal, but also in his willingness to adapt local cultural norms. So he was one of the first to really try to blend in. So he cut his hair like the traditional Chinese haircut, which was like bald in the front and kind of long in the back. And he would wear the traditional Chinese garb. And things that missionaries had. And I
love that. I love the story surrounding that too, because I think when Hudson Taylor was there, he went, and the other missionaries that had been there were often referred to by the local Chinese as absurd, because they dressed in these kind of black suits, traditional, pastoral suits that would have been common in Europe.
Yeah.
And they're wearing these, and they had no access to the people.
Right.
The people thought it was absurd and strange and even intimidating.
Yeah.
And when he realized that, he discovered that, the story goes, he went immediately to the market, he traded his clothes in, and he never went back. Like he never changed the way that he dressed, as long as he was with the people. And was powerful.
Yeah, and was mocked by other missionaries who ended up coming to China.
His boards that supported him were like, "What are you doing? Why are you doing this?"
Yeah.
He was reaching souls.
Yeah, he was.
Yeah.
And so he took what Paul said really literally, to become all things to all men, and realize that there are certain exteriors that don't matter.
Right.
Like how I wear my hair and the clothes that I wear. You may have personal preference.
Right.
But when we're talking about souls, it doesn't matter if I wear a hoodie, or if I do have to wear a suit and tie because that's culture, or if I put on, these long, weird looking pajamas. You go, all right, it's worth it for souls.
Yeah. All that's flexible in light of the gospel.
Right.
Yeah.
So we had China Inland Missions. Another thing that Hudson Taylor did that was unheard of was to start including more women in missions. Carrie actually took his wife, and then after that, a lot of people didn't. Missionaries would go without their wives, which seems weird.
That does seem weird, but there was a lot of fear, I guess.
Yeah. Partially maybe because of the story of Carrie's and his own wife. But Hudson Taylor brought single women onto the mission field, and so opened a whole new door for missionaries in terms of single women.
I suppose like they served a lot of different needs in terms of nursing and care and hospitality and connecting with the women in the community, which would have probably been, especially in some cultures, very faux pas for a man, a white man from Europe, to engage with women in a local community. That would have probably been very difficult.
Yeah, exactly. So again, Hudson Taylor's just sensitive to the culture that he's in, and sees the interaction between the sexes as being different in Asia than it was in Europe. And so he's willing to make those adjustments.
Yeah.
And invites
and there were women that were willing to go, which is a big deal. There's some pretty tough women that were going on the mission field in this time frame.
Even still, I mean, overwhelmingly, if you exclude families, 2/3 of singles are women, even still on the mission field.
Wow.
So men are actually underrepresented. Women are taking the lead in foreign missions.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Wow. That's a strong challenge to our young men, I think.
I think so.
Yeah.
Another step forward, late 1800s to even up to the mid 1900s, you have Cameron Townsend. who founded Wycliffe Translators. John Wycliffe was a man who had lived back in the 1300s and translated the Bible. But so the idea that the Bible should get into the hands of all peoples and in all languages became huge as well. It was birthed out of modern missions, which was good. The idea of getting the Bible into the hands of the people, back to the idea that Satan's okay with the Bible as long as it's not actually in the hands of the people.
If it's not alive.
Right. And so part of what broke that, we said, the printing press, King James Bible, we now have it. Now let's get it into a Chinese language. Carrie did that. He translated the Bible into Bengali himself. And so these people are working in translation. So you have a big translation movement that comes out of it as well.
Which is powerful, because even today there's so many dialects and languages who don't have any type of Bible, and there's so many that still have inferior translations that it is a big deal for people to have a Bible that they can trust in, and it shouldn't keep people from going. The fact that there isn't a Bible in a particular language, I suppose that's all the more reason for missionaries to go.
Right.
But nonetheless, the work of translation is a big deal.
Absolutely. Yeah. So having some Bible is better than having no Bible. And there's a lot to say there. You can get into places that have Bibles that we would say could be improved or weren't based on the right text.
Right.
There's a big discussion there, but if they have a Bible, use it. And use what you got and preach the gospel with it. And
absolutely.
So that was born out of modern missions. And then also the idea of the three self idea, which came about, a little actually more recently, even still. So the idea that churches should be indigenous, as we're reaching people, indigenous churches should be self-governing, self-supporting, and self-propagating. So this is the idea of the three self church in missions, meaning England has no authority over a Chinese church. And the idea of connecting them and actually establishing local churches that have the vision of establishing more local churches. They should be self-governing and self-propagating and self-supporting. So cut from the funds of the wealthier West.
Not reliant. And this is such a big deal. I'm glad you brought it up, because in a time frame where colonialization was still a thing, like early modern missions, the West had conquered so much of the East and the South, and really to no avail. Like coming in, trying to teach people to dress like Europeans, force them into European culture, trying to modernize them, was actually unprofitable. And a lot of missions groups, I won't name any of them, went with maybe more of a cultural intention than a gospel intention. And so they're forcing cultural ideas onto people. And that's, for them, success is to get the locals to dress like a European and to learn English, and rather than turning the work over to the nationals, to the locals, so that they can be everything God made them to be and reach their culture for the gospel. I guess that's the primary difference there. Yeah,
absolutely. And so I'll piggyback off that in just a second, because there are some kind of negative sides that came out of the modern missions movement. But you're right. So that brings us all the way basically to where we are today. When we look at our church and churches like ours, we take a lot of what we believe in missions from the Bible, from the examples in Acts and early missions. But we also take a lot of it from this modern missions movement, and the idea that we should take the gospel and in their language and into their culture without compromising the gospel and the truth. What's flexible is flexible, and what's fixed is fixed. And then create these churches and turn them over and let them run with it.
Right.
And so, that's our heart. And that's what we're striving to do. And so, we talked about the idea that Satan wants to counteract. Early on, he tries to kill all the Christians. He wants to counteract the movement. And then he wants to counteract by just making sure there's no Bible, right? It's inaccessible. Once he sees that won't happen, now you've got a proliferation of English Bibles, and then the idea that we should take the Bible into every language as well. Satan begins this idea of counterfeiting instead of directly counteracting. And so one thing that has come out of the missions movement is now the proliferation of Bibles. and the proliferation of English translations, and the idea that we can always be improving on God's word, and or a translation for every church or every idea that comes up. So that has swung out of the missions movement.
Yeah, so there's an abuse of the concept of getting the word into everybody's hand. Now the Bible becomes evolutionary in nature, and we can always make improvements on it. So that's the flip side of that coin.
I will be excited for an emoji Bible, though, like just all stories and all emojis.
The moment that happens,
I'll look at that.
Is the moment the Antichrist reveals himself. So, I wouldn't get too excited about that.
I mean, that's the next natural step, right?
I guess so.
Yeah,
that's a disappointing thought, but
yeah. So, so also coming out of missions and where we're at in just, 21st century missions as really after World War II, the push in missions started to shift away from the gospel and towards humanitarian work. And that has just grown and grown and grown. Not that there's anything wrong with also influencing, lifespan or literacy rates or clean water or any of those things. It's the problem is that it comes at the, at the expense of the gospel. We only have time to do one. So let's educate. Let's make sure the women's literacy is, up to Western standards, but never take the time to give the gospel.
Right. So specializing actually distracts from the gospel. So you've got people who are going to do medical missions, but the gospel and the word of God isn't at the center of that work. They see themselves as playing a role versus, encompassing the gospel in whatever way they need. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. So instead of, your talents or training being a tool, it becomes the primary thing. And then the gospel gets pushed to the back burner. And gets put to the side. I am a nurse myself. Right. And even in my missions roles, I had to function as a nurse in order to stay in a country. So it was a tool, but every day the primary focus was sharing the gospel. Right. So we've swung too far that way in modern missions. We're doing a really good job of helping people get smarter and healthier. Yeah. Just so they can live a little longer before they end up in hell. And probably one other idea that came out of this same time period and push is also the proliferation of the agency instead of the church. Yeah. And so again, a counterfeiting of what is true in God's heart, God using the local church as His agent,
equipping, training, edifying.
Yeah. I mean, you get the church, the Word, and the Spirit. And that's what you need to accomplish the work. Well, they've taken away the word and they're taking away the church, and they're like, well, just run with us. And so you lose your authority structures and your oversight. And so I think we've also swung probably too far in that direction as well. Not that there's necessarily anything wrong. Again, I went with a missions agency, a good one that was able to help us get where we needed to go. Not all missions agencies are bad.
We were a young church and we didn't know how to get you to where you needed to go on the mission field, and this group helped.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's history of missions.
Man. So okay. So as we close, because there's so much to say about this, and maybe we'll do deep dives in other aspects of missions history in the future, but we've got young people who, LFBI students, people in churches, people that are listening to this, who have a heart for the mission field. They're interested in church planting. They want to develop themselves to be leaders and prepare themselves for whatever God has them, and that might include foreign missions. If this is an area of interest, you mentioned earlier reading some of the biographies of men like William Carey, that's a great asset to getting, a sober view of what the mission field can be like. What are some other resources, other books that you recommend in terms of better understanding modern missions or missions history or men and women within the movement? Yeah.
So any, missionary biography, and you can find a lot of them for free, like on Amazon. If you've got a Kindle, you can get that version, read them for free.
Yeah, because they've been around for so long, they're public domain.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Fox's Book of Martyrs, looking at some of the struggles of Christian missionaries throughout history.
That'll get you to count the cost real quick. Those stories.
Yeah. Truth Triumphant will cover a big swath of missions history, including the disciples, early church fathers, and from Israel to Iran Jaya. More modern history of missions from about William Carey up to present. Missionary Methods, St. Paul's Are Ours by Roland Allen.
Okay.
Would be another book just
Yeah,
in
I've heard
terms of, it's more about philosophy and the theology of missions. And that would be some good places to start in terms of just looking at the history of missions, also a little bit to inform your view of missions. Yeah.
And so with that said, maybe also make a pitch. We've got an introduction to missions class that you teach here. And then in the future, really in the next year or two, we're going to be rolling out 8-week courses that focus on different areas of church planting, fundraising, aspects that missionaries need will become an integral part of LFBI in our curriculum. But maybe make a pitch real quick for everybody taking that introduction to missions class that you teach.
That's it, man. You just said it. Everybody should take it because everybody needs to know where they came from. Everyone should know their history. Everyone should know the cost that was counted by so many. Everyone should recognize how easy we have it in American Christianity at the moment, and should be stirred by what has happened in the past. We'll take, the stuff, we just took 30 minutes to cover, 2,500 years of history. We want to dive into that and break that down and get you a better handle on what was going on historically, but and socially. There were a lot of movements in society that we briefly mentioned that were impacting, missions as well. But everybody should do it.
Yeah, I agree. James, it's good to hang with you. We got another couple interviews to do that'll come out over the next couple weeks, and so I'm excited about that as well. So thanks for joining me and enlightening us to modern missions and how that impacts us even today.
Yeah,
so
my pleasure.
Man. And we want to thank you as well for joining us for another episode of the Postscript. We're always hoping that these episodes are edifying and strengthening to you, inspiring. If this topic interests you, of course, we want you to take Introduction to Missions. It'll be in an upcoming semester, so keep an eye out for that. In the meantime, visit lfbi.org. Check out our whole class roster, all the courses that we offer. They're all there and available to you to look at and to check out. We would love to have you join us for any of these classes that are leadership, developing, and doctrinal in nature. But we love you and we're grateful for you. God bless you, and we'll see you again next week.